So I was thinking that in the 20 years that I've spent in HR, what is it that I have come across most often as either success or failure? There are two things that jumped out. Both starts with a C. One is cricket, some numbers, and the other is companies. You can look at myself and realize that I don't play cricket all that often, and hence I will sort of focus on companies. Let me give you some numbers. First is a set of numbers on cricket. Allow me to sort of explain this universe and why I say that success is hard. And when I was looking at the numbers, I was quite surprised by the similarity between this vast game of cricket in this country and companies worldwide. What I've done is, quite literally don't take the size of the universe, but just the percentages which are important. If you take the population of the country and take the playing age of 15 to 40, that's the first world that you see. That's roughly 260 million people in that age bracket who qualify to play. Now, there was some survey that was done, surprisingly, by the government of India about 5-6 years ago to determine the number of people who play the game. Now, there is a possibility that there's a little bit of change in that number, but roughly 20% of the total population of 15 to 40 play the game, which is about 54 million. Take a look at the next few numbers. The number of players who have played the game of IPL in 2000, or basically the list of FY18, is about 200. Now if you look at the percentages, it drops dramatically. And if you go on further, which is the number of players who have played the one-day game in the last 3 years, as you can see the percentage, it drops even further. It is 0.0001. The playing 11, is just even more smaller. Now for grads from an IIM, let's compare these numbers to companies and what happens there. There are about 120 million companies worldwide. The number of firms that operate in this country is about 1.3 million. If you look at the percentages which go on further, the number of listed firms in the world is about 45,000. And as you see, the numbers who make up the percentage of Fortune 500 or the Fortune 50 is very, very similar to the number of players who make it to the top of the cricket world. What is surprising to me is how the number of companies drop. In fact, when I was looking at it, I didn't realize that the sharpness is this steep. Now let's look at a couple of other data points. What I did is I compared the top 10 companies, most valuable companies as of 2000, and looked at the list as of 2018. There are two very, very interesting data points there. One is, except for three, which is Microsoft, ExxonMobil, and Johnson & Johnson, the whole list has changed. The other interesting data point there is, if you look at except for one, which is right at the top, GE. Can you see the difference in valuation? The bottom of 2000, or rather the bottom of 2018, is the other way around for 2000. That's the amount of shift that has happened. In fact, most organizations in this list, while the list itself has changed, it has doubled, if not more. And we recently celebrated the company that got to $1 trillion valuation. There are two other data points that I thought were interesting again. One is, if you look at the list between 1955 and 2018, only 60 of the 500 are still in there. And if you look at a third data set, in the next 10 years, half of Fortune 500 organizations that are there today will disappear. Now, why, and then allow me to make one more point, and then I'll go to the reasons of picking it up. Two graphs, one on the left, which talks about the lifespan. The point I'm trying to make is that things that happen today that constitute success, whether it is at an individual level, whether it is at a group level, or whether it is at a company level, things are changing much faster than it used to change before. The graph on the left illustrates that. If you go back to 1965, the tenure of companies that existed in that revered list of S&P 500, the tenure was 33 years. If we fast forward into 1990, the tenure has dropped to 20. And if we go back to, or rather the forecast, which is 2026, the tenure actually drops to 14. And I don't know if it will actually become faster as we go towards 2026. When we compare this with tenure of employees, I was a little surprised by this data point. A lot of us believe that tenure has also shrunk. As I looked at the data, what we realized is there is a huge difference between developed nations and developing nations. If you take an example of a country like India, yes, the tenure has dropped. But the graph on the right that we see is actually a Department of Labor statistics of what is the tenure of folks between 1990 all the way to 2018. As you can see, the average tenure of the total average or the male-female seen separately has not dropped. So what does this mean for all of you as you, let's say, get out of this institute, join with revered successful organizations? Many of you will go on to create your own organizations. What I want to share with you today are 4 points that I have learned over these 20 years that I would like to believe are central to making organizations that you join or may join in the future successful, or organizations that you create from ground up are core to make it lasting for a slightly longer period of time. Eventually it will catch up, but I believe that these are 4 fundamental pillars that I would like to share that I think has become important. The first of that is changing customer needs. There are three segments in this slide. I'll pick up two for paucity of time. Let me pick up the appointed viewing versus anytime viewing. Some of you are younger, but if I were to go back to my days in school, and I was born in a remote part of Assam, we used to call it back of the beyond. TV always used to be collective viewing. And if I were to sort of refresh your memory, it still exists as a brand. I don't know about how many of you watch it today. If raise of hands, how many of you see MTV? I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Now let's go back 20 years. It was a time when viewing media, which was at an appointed time, was always collective. Whether it was MTV or CHRO or the favorite movie that we wanted to see, we all would come together as a family, see it at 8 o'clock on Wednesday. As we move from a developing nation to a developed nation, or rather in that journey as we move forward, what has happened is viewing has become very, very personal. I see what I want to see. I don't want to see what you see. Add the explosion of screens that has happened over these years. What it has done is suddenly the appointed viewing has moved to a anytime viewing with personalized or individual screens that we always see content. In the process, what has happened is youth that used to celebrate its collectiveness in a brand like MTV suddenly moved to social as a platform. What happened overnight was that the customer need changed very, very significantly, and almost with brands of that nature not noticing it. The second example is where I work today, Tata Technologies. It's an engineering services firm, and all of you must be noticing all that is going on these days about IC engines, the internal combustion engines, giving way to electric vehicles. And this shift is so sudden and so significant. It's almost like a million parts that went into making of an IC engine becomes one block of a battery that will drive electric vehicles moving forward. So the point being that one of the most important pillars of creating successful organizations is to understand how customer needs change. The second is the role of the ecosystem, within the ecosystem. And I'll try and articulate this right. What we most often get within an organization, or when you're creating an organization of your own, you get the first part right, which is if I were to define the strategy of an organization, whether it is the market position, the innovation or differentiation, or changing the rules of the game as an organization, we get our positioning usually right. It is to say that I will be running down the innovation route, and maybe what I'll pick up as a trait is being a pioneer. What I believe we often don't do is to translate that into the next three, which is if we believe as an organization that we will be the pioneer, or let's say within innovation we will be pioneer, what we don't end up doing is articulating the next three, that if that be so, what are the values that we would inculcate? And if that are the set of values, what behaviors and traits would I have within my organization, and thereby what culture am I inculcating for the success of that organization. So that becomes the second pillar, is understanding very, very well what the role of an organization is in that ecosystem. The second last, and I take this only as an example. There are various other methodologies that one can lay their hands into. But I think, understanding how organizations run the business is extremely important. I'm not going to go into each of these 9 boxes that we have. It's called the lean canvas, and I borrowed the work that Ashok had done. But it is extremely important to understand the entire value chain of what problem are we solving, all the way to understanding the revenue streams. And it's fairly common in the current India startup ecosystem. But if you go and have a conversation with, let's say, most of the founders who are wanting to run or create an organization, and ask them this question, that can you define this entire value chain that's there within the lean canvas? I'm really surprised as to how many actually struggle to really, really well articulate it. The last is what I call the journey of moving from leaders to leadership brand. As you can see, there are 2 vectors here. One is the individual leader, which is moving from inside to outside, and the other is moving from leader to leadership. As we grow within the organization, or as the business itself grows, as the organizations grow, the journey that one needs to watch out for very, very clearly is the diagonal one, which is starting at the left bottom, all the way moving to the right top, which is actually creating an organization that stands for a brand of leadership. There are many, many, many examples of that. We're preaching to the choir if I ask for the names, but think about companies that come to your mind which stand for a leadership brand within a particular category. So with that, my last slide is, as you all graduate out of a prestigious college of this nature, as you go and chart out your own journey within, let's say, other organizations that are existing or end up creating, these are 4 experiences or pillars that I thought I would share today, which I believe is extremely important for success in what you do. Thank you very much.